thank you, Vernon. Thank you, Roger, for having me. Start with, I want to mention a couple things. I tend to have a soft voice, so if I fade off and you can't hear me, let me know. Also, I want to mention I have our company logo on there, but the opinions that I'm going to express today are entirely my own and not necessarily Suemaur's. I want to thank Laura again for helping me. She's the beautiful brain involved in this. She's done all the graphics for me, and she and I have worked together for longer than she would admit. So I love questions. So anytime during this presentation that you want to ask a question, please ask it. You don't have to wait till the end. Just fire away. I enjoy questions. The audience generally enjoys questions and probably gets a lot more out of any kind of presentation when there are questions. So, let's begin. Global climate change. Consensus, conundrum, or common sense? These are some of the people that I work with that have been most helpful to me. And then I have a couple of three close friends that have also are technical advisors. Philip Froelich, Joe Donahue, and John Anderson at their respective universities. They try and keep me on track, and I do a pretty good job. Well, global climate change has become the great scientific, economic, and political obsession of the day. No scientific issue since the advent of the atomic age has been more controversial, more politicized, and more hyped than the concept that mankind is dramatically altering the Earth's climate through the release of greenhouse gases. So my objective today is to briefly review the scientific arguments for and against the concept of catastrophic anthropogenic global climate change. Hopefully this brief synopsis will prompt several questions and comments. My interest in climate change began in 1970 while I was researching the effects of sea level change on the river systems in the Alabama coastal plain. Climate. It's what you expect. Weather's what you get. Everyone talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. Mark Twain. Well, today, the widely publicized view is that man is finally doing something about the weather. We're making it worse. Some of you may remember, probably some of the people on the front row here, not so many in the back row, may remember the climate crisis of the 70s. These comments, Nigel Calder, writing in the National Wildlife, the threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery for mankind. And then C.C. Wallen of the World Meteorological Organization warned, cooling since 1940 has been large enough and consistent enough that it will not soon be reversed. Thus, in 3 short decades, the consensus has switched from global cooling to global warming. Talk about climate confusion. Today, everyone, virtually everyone, has an opinion on the subject of global warming. And the following is a sample of the diversity of opinion. Rasmussen conducted a poll last year and asked the question, what causes global warming? Well, 34% of the respondents said it was due to human activity, while 48% said it was due to long-term planetary trends. And then there's a political view. Few challenges facing America and the world are more urgent than combating climate change. The science is beyond dispute. The facts are clear. President Barack Obama. And then there's a bureaucratic viewpoint. This is James Hansen, the head of the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies in New York. a Nuremberg-style trial for climate realists who disagree with his claims of warming, of catastrophic warming, are appropriate. And then there's the environmentalist point of view. Paul Ehrlich, who's the author of the Population Bomb, environmental author, states, people are a cancer on Earth. And David Graeber, an environmental extremist, writes in the LA Times that for the sake of a healthy planet, some of us can only help for the right virus to come along to wipe out Homo sapiens. Rather extreme. And then we always have the media overhype. In Time magazine last year, be worried, be very worried. And of course, the iconic polar bear trying to figure out how to get back to solid ice. But then there's also the contrarian scientist view by Ian Plemmer. We are facing the greatest global threat in my 62 years. It is not global warming. It's the threat from policy responses to perceived global warming and demonizing of dissent. Over the next 40 years, the world's population will increase by almost 50%, increasing from about 6.5 billion to 9 billion. 2/3 of the growth will occur in Africa and Asia. The remainder will be in Latin America and the Caribbean. North America and Europe will experience little or no growth. Thus, even if you believe that human activity is responsible for the current warming event, there is no environmental expenditure or effort that will make any long-term difference unless we address population growth. But that subject is well beyond the scope of my talk. So what do we know to a high degree of certainty regarding climate change? Since the end of the Little Ice Age, early in the 19th century, the average global temperature has risen by 1 degree Celsius. Since the beginning of the Industrial Age, carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere from 280 parts per million to 390 parts per million. The current episode of alpine and Arctic glacial shortening began soon after the end of the Little Ice Age. Sea level is currently rising and has been rising for several decades at about 2 millimeters per year. About half of the sea level rise is due to melting of the glaciers on the continent, and the other half is due to thermal expansion of seawater as it warms. So, the quintessential climate question is not, is the climate changing? It constantly does, based on geological and historical data. It is likely warmer now than it was in 1880. Global warming exists, global cooling will follow. The debatable question is, have human activities overwhelmed the Earth's dynamic climate system, or does nature continue to control the climate through normal physical processes? This photograph I took last fall while in New York City. And the photograph sublimely illustrates the axiom, the only climate constant is change. The prominent trough in this picture is a gash carved in the bedrock of Manhattan Island as a mile-thick mass of glacial ice slowly progressed across New York City between 13 and 18,000 years ago. The next 5 slides show temperature trends over different time frames, starting 180 million years ago, followed by successively shorter intervals of time. In this slide, note that the overall decline in global temperature since the Mesozoic, starting about 135 million years ago. In the next slide, note that the interglacial period 120,000 years ago was warmer than present. Sea level was 6 to 8 meters higher, and Arctic temperatures were as much as 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the present interglacial. In this slide, Note that during the last 11,000 years, there were several periods when the temperature in the northern hemisphere was both warmer or cooler than present. These fluctuations were obviously not the result of human activity. The medieval warm period from 900 to 1300 AD was the time when the Vikings established settlements in Greenland and Iceland. With the onset of the Little Ice Age, in the late 1300s, the Viking colonies began to die out due to increasing cold and the continuation of sea ice well into the summer, which prevented resupply and trade with Europe. In this slide, I've combined two data sets on temperature using a zero temperature deviation line based on the 1961 to 1990 mean temperature in degrees Celsius. Note that global temperatures have increased by about 1 degree Celsius in the last 125,000 years. The next graph shows the temperature trend over the last 35 years. And this is the time frame in which we've had satellite records of basically the entire globe. Note that since 1998, which is a very strong, or was a very strong El Nino year, the global temperature initially declined and then stabilized. So, is there any data that conclusively proves that the warming trend since the middle of the 19th century is due primarily to human activity? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and you may have heard that name and those initials frequently, places great confidence in the predictive accuracy of mathematical simulations of the climate. These models are frequently referred to as the general circulation models, or GCMs. The GCMs are used to project future global warming resulting from the increase of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide. But models are not data. As sophisticated as the current models are, they only incorporate a limited number of the many natural variables that affect global climate. As a result, the GCMs have thus far proven to be very unreliable in projecting future temperature. In this slide shows the predicted temperature increases resulting from increasing carbon dioxide for 7 different IPCC models starting in 1990. The gray area is the envelope or range of variability for all of the models. The blue line represents the actual or observed temperature. Note that none of the models predicted that over the past decade, the temperature would initially decline and then stabilize. Thus far, none of the models have been able to reproduce either the medieval warm period or the Little Ice Age. On this slide, shown in red and green, are model predicted temperatures and their increases starting in 1988. If no effort was made to reduce the growth of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The blue line is the projected temperature trend if drastic cuts in CO2 emissions were made starting in 1988. And in orange is the plot of the actual or measured average global temperature through 2008. The actual temperature is 0.6 of a degree Celsius lower than predicted by the models, which is a very significant error in only 20 years. Remembering that over the last 125 years, the temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius. The IPCC attributes most of the warming since the beginning of the industrial age to an increase in greenhouse gases resulting from human activities. So what is the current composition of the Earth's atmosphere? The major components of the Earth's atmosphere are nitrogen, representing about 78% of the atmosphere by volume, oxygen at just under 21%, and argon at just under 1%. Carbon dioxide is a minor component of the atmosphere, comprising less than 4/10 or less than 4/100% by volume. Water vapor is not included in this because it varies. And it generally varies between 10,000 and 40,000 parts per million, which makes it by far and away the largest component of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is water vapor. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, ozone are all greenhouse gases and are predominantly natural, not anthropogenic in their origin. The remaining greenhouse gases, which are various chlorofluorocarbons, are present in trace amounts only and are predominantly anthropogenic. As I mentioned, of the greenhouse gases, water vapor is by far and away the largest component, comprising 95% by volume of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Man's contribution to the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere is about 0.3%. Since the beginning of the industrial age, human activity may have increased atmospheric concentrations of CO2 from about 280 parts to 390 parts per million. In other words, because of human activity, CO2 now occupies 1/10,000th more atmospheric volume than it did in the middle of the 19th century. So, how much CO2 enters the atmosphere annually? Whoops. About 160 or 106 gigatons enters the atmosphere from the ocean. About 71 gigatons are exhaled by animals, including human beings. And about 6 gigatons are generated due to human activity, with the remainder, plus or minus 3 gigatons, other natural sources. So as we noted, about 3% of the carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere is due to human activity. This graph was prominently shown in Al Gore's book and motion picture, An Inconvenient Truth. In it, he implies that as atmospheric CO2 increases, there is a subsequent increase in temperature.
When there's more CO2, the temperature goes
up. There is, however, one big problem with this observation. Based on ice core records, CO2 increases lag temperature increases by several hundred years. He has cause and effect reversed. Cause cannot follow effect. As the atmospheric temperature rises and subsequently warms the oceans, the capacity of the oceans to hold CO2 in solution decreases, resulting in a transfer of CO2 from the oceans to the atmosphere. Just as an open can of soda loses its carbon dioxide as it warms on your tabletop. It should be noted that there is 50 times more carbon dioxide in the oceans than there is in the atmosphere. As we observed previously, natural processes source 99.7% of all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So how sensitive is temperature to increasing concentrations of atmospheric CO2? temperature response to increasing carbon dioxide is strongly logarithmic, and as a result, climate sensitivity decreases rapidly with increasing CO2 concentrations. This was arrived at experimentally at the University of Chicago. Now, it's important to note that this is a dry atmosphere. There is no water vapor included in these experiments. Clear sky means it's an atmosphere that contains no water vapor. So that's not the situation on Earth, obviously. As we know, water vapor is the most abundant greenhouse gas in the Earth's atmosphere. Temperature increases as a result of CO2 forcing produce a corresponding increase in atmospheric water vapor, which may cause a further increase in the average global temperature because it's a greenhouse gas. And this is known as a positive feedback. However, increasing atmospheric water vapor may also increase low-level cloud formation, which would increase the Earth's albedo, or its reflective capacity, thus lowering the Earth's average temperature. And this effect is known as a negative feedback. This is Michael Mann's temperature reconstruction for the last 1,000 years. This temperature reconstruction became known as the Mann hockey stick and was featured in the IPCC 2001 report as strong proof of anthropogenic global warming. The Mann temperature graph for the northern hemisphere shows an overall gentle decline in temperature until about 1900. Starting in 1900, there was an abrupt incline in the temperature trend. In this next diagram is a smooth plot of the Mann temperature and time plot, with the gray highlighting illustrating the overall hockey stick shape. The proxies Mann used for his temperature history reconstruction were primarily tree rings from the Sierra Nevada range. Unfortunately, Mann did not make proper adjustments for variables other than temperature that also affect tree growth, such as availability of sunlight, soil moisture, and so on and so forth. Additionally, the algorithms and statistics that he used for his temperature reconstruction were also faulty. The result was his temperature reconstruction prior to the instrumental record removed prior temperature variations. The lower graph properly reflects both the medieval warm period from 950 to 1400 AD and the subsequent cool period, commonly referred to as the Little Ice Age. Despite the fact that Mann's temperature reconstruction was deeply flawed, the hockey stick was still prominently featured in the 2001 third assessment report of the IPCC. By way of example, based on Mann's temperature reconstruction, the IPCC in 2001 summary mistakenly claimed, and I quote, that the 1990s has been the warmest decade and 1998 was the warmest year in the last millennium in the northern hemisphere. So, if increasing concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide are not primarily responsible for the modern warming event, what is? How about the sun? This plot shows a very good correlation between solar magnetic cycle length and temperature. So why would solar magnetic cycle length affect global temperatures on Earth? Lower solar magnetic field strength results in fewer sunspots, which produces a lower solar wind, which allows for an increase in galactic cosmic radiation, which produces more low-level cloud formation. More sunlight is reflected into space, resulting in the Earth becoming slightly cooler. Now, I will admit, several scientists disagree with this explanation of global cooling, but the correlation between sunspot cycle length and temperature is very intriguing. In this diagram, note that CO2 increases in a linear fashion, while sunspot cycle length and temperature vary together, but not linearly. Alpine glaciers around the world generally began to lose mass and shorten early in the 19th century, following the end of the Little Ice Age and prior to the beginning of the Industrial Age. Glacial mass varies predominantly with a change in temperature and a change in precipitation. Note that the slope or trend line for glacial shortening has remained more or less constant in spite of the fact that the use of hydrocarbon fuels dramatically increased after 1940. So today we hear a lot about the loss of Arctic sea ice. These three satellite photos, which were taken from National Geographic, show a progressive loss of Arctic sea ice beginning in 1979 and extending through 2007. The loss of sea ice in the Arctic produces a positive feedback, which magnifies the temperature increase in the Arctic. The transformation of Arctic ice to seawater and tundra results in a significant increase in the absorption of solar energy in the Arctic region. And this explains, at least in part, why the Arctic is experiencing the fastest rate of warming as its highly reflective surface is reduced as the Arctic sea ice melts and snow retreats. And this clip from September 2009, two German merchant ships have traversed the fabled Northeast Passage after global warming and melting ice opened a route from South Korea along Russia's Arctic coast all the way to Siberia. That's September of last year. And then there's this report from the U.S. Weather Bureau. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers, he declared, all point to a radical change in climate conditions and heretofore unheard of temperatures in the Arctic zone. Exploration expeditions report that scarcely any ice has been met with as far north as 81 degrees 29 minutes. Significantly, the date on that report is 1922. So, this apparently has happened before. It's happened before in recorded history, less than a century ago. So, here's a few observations, some of my opinions, and conclusions. The average global temperature has increased by approximately 1 degree Celsius since the end of the Little Ice Age. Anthropogenic or human-produced greenhouse gases, in my opinion, are responsible for about 20% of the increase, or roughly 0.2 degrees Celsius. Further increases in atmospheric CO2 will have only a minor effect on increasing temperature. Increased atmospheric CO2 will enhance plant growth through carbon fertilization. The rate and magnitude of global temperature fluctuations since the end of the Little Ice Age are well within the range of previous temperature changes as documented in the geologic record, namely ice cores and marine sediments. The global circulation models that the IPC has based their temperature projections on failed to project or predict the post-1998 temperature decline, and they have been unable to replicate past temperature increases and decreases, such as the medieval optimum, by back-modeling. The GCM models failed in part because of their emphasis on greenhouse gas forcing and their inability to accurately model the effects of clouds, precipitation, aerosols, solar irradiation, and many other natural variables. In short, these models do not begin to replicate the real world. And here's my list of what I consider, oh, excuse me, we've got another conclusion. There is no consensus on anthropogenic global climate change, and the science is clearly not settled beyond dispute. The current hysteria over impending CO2-induced global climate catastrophe is clearly unjustified, and spending trillions of dollars to solve a problem that may not exist or probably doesn't exist is the ultimate insanity. The Earth's dynamic and ever-changing climate is controlled by variations in solar radiation, changes in orbital cycles, and natural phenomena, and mostly not due to man. The belief in human-induced apocalyptic global warming has become a secular religion. This theology is based not on objective science, but on the dogma of environmental fundamentalists and zealots. For some, objective science doesn't matter. No matter if the science is all phony, there are collateral environmental benefits. Climate change provides the greatest chance to bring about justice and equality in the world. Canadian Environment Minister. Unless we announce disasters, no one will listen. Sir John Houghton, first chairman of the IPCC. The Green Movement has been taken over by neo-Marxists promoting anti-trade, anti-globalization, and anti-civilization, none other than Dr. Patrick Moore, the founder of Greenpeace. So here's my list of absolute absurdities, in my opinion. The member countries of the G8 have agreed to restrict CO2 emissions to a level such that global temperatures would not increase by more than 2 degrees Celsius. Apparently, they have relegated all natural climate forcing phenomenon, including the sun, to a place of insignificance. The EPA has determined that CO2 and other greenhouse gases are a pollutant and an endangerment to public health and the environment. CO2 is the primary source of carbon. That element is fundamental to all life on Earth. And following that logic, you could conclude that water causes drowning and therefore is an endangerment to public health. And then there's the Fifth Circuit Court has given standing to a group of 12 Gulf Coast residents whose homes were damaged by Hurricane Katrina. The plaintiffs are suing 33 energy companies for greenhouse gas emissions that allegedly contributed to global warming, that allegedly made the hurricane more powerful. Well, this is what I believe. Mankind has imprinted the global climate, but thus far, ever so slightly. There are legitimate reasons to responsibly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but catastrophic anthropogenic global warming is not one of them. The belief in catastrophic anthropogenic global warming is a manifestation of Hollywood cinema and environmental zealots and not objective science. Fossil fuels are, after all, a finite resource, and for that reason, if for no other, we must develop replacement sources. However, spending vast sums to deploy today's renewable technologies, which are inefficient, unreliable, inordinately expensive, and add very little to base load power, is a solution the world cannot afford. A far better outcome will result from increased investments in research and development of advanced technologies which ultimately will make carbon-free sources of energy viable. And now, we've heard a lot about the consensus on global climate change, but I'll venture that most of you have never heard of the Oregon Petition. This is the consensus of contrarian American scientists that the United Nations will not acknowledge and the media chooses to ignore. This position has been signed by 32,000 American scientists with degrees in science, including 9,000 PhDs. And this is the petition. I'll read a couple sentences from the second paragraph. There is no convincing scientific evidence that human-released carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will, in the foreseeable future, cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. This particular petition was signed by Edward Teller, one of the fathers of the atomic age. And then next is the cover letter that goes with this petition. The United States is very close to adopting an international agreement that would ration the use of energy and of technologies that depend on coal, oil, and natural gas, and some organic compounds. This treaty is, in our opinion, based on flawed ideas. Research data on climate change do not show that human use of hydrocarbons is harmful. To the contrary, there is good evidence that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide in the environment may be helpful. And this particular cover letter was prepared by Frederick Seitz, past president of the National Academy of Sciences and president emeritus of Rockefeller University. So with that, let's end on a little lighter note. Here's some other sources of hot air and CO2. And then there's this, the climate summit. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? A better world indeed, unless of course we destroy the global economy and lower the standard of living worldwide in the process. And then there's this. You gotta wonder how long these humans can survive as a species. Once again, you can't help but wonder how the poor polar bears managed without man's help during the last 3 interglacials, which were all warmer than the present event. And then there's this. And I think the Texas saying is very appropriate. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So that's it. I appreciate the opportunity to